Have you ever seen a stray dog break into a canine training facility, not to steal food but to ask for something more? To be part of it? No collar, no history, just a determined look in his eyes and something about him that made the whole team stop in their tracks. This isn't a story about a perfect dog. It's the journey of one who was rejected, step by step proving that being born imperfect doesn't mean you can't become extraordinary. You're watching Dog Stories, where every story is an emotional journey between people and their dogs. If you love stories that truly touch the heart, don't forget to like and subscribe, because Riley might just change the way you see dogs forever. Now, let's go back to where it all began. A cold winter morning, and a dog no one was waiting for. But no one had the heart to turn away. The sun hadn't risen yet. A thick morning fog blanketed the low hills behind the K9 training center in the outskirts of Colorado. It seemed like just another quiet morning until the alarm at the side gate went off. Sergeant Jack Monroe was in his office making coffee. He frowned and glanced at the security monitor, hoping it was just a stray cat or the wind catching a loose panel. But on the screen, a small black figure flashed by in a blur. A puppy. No one knew where it came from. No collar. No tags. Just a pair of bright, alert eyes and a dusty nose pressed up against the glass of the training facility where the canine dogs were still fast asleep. It didn't bark, didn't scratch at the door, it just watched. Jack stepped outside, walking slowly toward the strange little creature. His hand rested quietly on the leash, just in case the stray showed signs of aggression. But instead, the moment the puppy saw a human, it dropped flat to the ground, tail wagging wildly, front paws stretched forward in complete surrender, as if it was saying, "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to stay." "Who are you, little guy?" Jack muttered, crouching down for a closer look. A German Shepherd pup, barely 3 months old. Its dark coat was caked in mud, patchy from neglect. But the eyes made him pause. There was something steady in that gaze. Something far too grown up for a puppy. By then, the whole training team had been woken up. They poured outside, half surprised, half amused, watching a small puppy trying to squeeze through the gate just to follow Sergeant Jack. Probably ran away from home or got abandoned, one soldier guessed. Maybe it belongs to someone nearby, another offered. While everyone debated, the puppy quietly slipped between Jack's legs and walked right into the training compound like it had always belonged there. It made a slow lap, sniffing each kennel bed, every mat soaked with the smell of disinfectant. When it came across a senior K9, it backed off just slightly, then wagged its tail, not in fear, but in respect. "Look at that attitude," Jack chuckled. "He probably thinks he's the newest recruit." The whole team agreed to give it a temporary name, Riley, short, easy to call, and with a bit of that military feel. From that moment on, Riley became an uninvited guest no one had the heart to turn away. He wasn't officially adopted, but the little pup quickly treated the entire training compound like home. Every morning when the wake-up siren blared, Riley was the first one out on the field, lying down and quietly watching every drill, every command. Whenever someone walked by, he wagged his tail, bounced around, then politely backed off, like he already knew the rules of military conduct. What puzzled the whole team was this: Riley refused to leave. 3 nights in a row, they tried escorting him out of the training area, even opened the gate and walked him several hundred yards away. But within hours, Riley would be right back, sitting outside the duty office like he never left. One night, a heavy rain poured down. Riley still lay there, soaked to the bone, not making a single sound. "He might have been a stray," Jack muttered as he stepped out and gently laid a dry towel over Riley's back. "But it sure looks like he doesn't want to live like one anymore." A quiet debate started among the team. Some worried Riley might disrupt the trained dogs. Others were concerned that the intense drills could be dangerous for an unvetted pup. But there were also those, especially Jack, who had started to realize this dog was trying to prove something. That night, Jack sat alone in his office, gently running his hand over a blank file labeled K9 Dog, Status Undetermined, Riley. His eyes drifted to the security monitor. Riley was lying still in a corner of the yard, his head against a wooden frame, eyes wide open, as if he was standing guard for the whole unit. That sight made Jack's chest tighten just a little. Some dogs, he thought, are born to guard and protect. They don't need to be trained to understand what loyalty means. "All right, kid," Jack muttered, pen in hand, as he wrote the very first line in the file. Day 1, Riley appeared. No collar, no history. But maybe a reason to stay. Day 2 since Riley broke into the canine training compound. The weather was still cold and windy like the day before. But this time, there was no alarm. No sirens. Riley was already a familiar face. The little pup lay curled up on the steps outside the office, head resting on his front paws, eyes lazily tracking the marching boots that passed him by. When the team began their early morning drills, Riley got up and followed each person for a few steps, then quietly backed away when the commands were given. No one had taught him, but he somehow knew not to get in the way, knew when to step in and when to pull back. But all that charm didn't change one thing. Riley was still an outsider. And the first thing people noticed when he tried to slip into the training field was he didn't move quite like the other dogs. "There's something off with his back legs," Aaron Jude muttered, watching Riley weave through the training cones. Jack crouched down and called softly. Riley walked over and gently rolled to his side for inspection. And just as Jack suspected, both of Riley's back legs had an extra toe, known as a dew claw. They stuck out awkwardly, easily bumped when running at high speed, and if not addressed properly, they could become a serious liability in training. "A dog with a birth defect," someone said quietly. "He can't be a canine." It wasn't said with malice, just a truth that was hard to deny. In the canine world, standards are strict. One offbeat step, a split-second delay in reaction. Sometimes that's the line between success and failure, between life and death. But Riley didn't seem to care about being labeled unfit. He kept following the trainers, trying to mimic every move the adult dogs were making. When Jack gave the command down, Riley dropped too. When the team ran the obstacle course, Riley crawled through the plastic tunnel on his own, his little body bumping the sides twice along the way. At mealtime, when the dogs were given their individual portions, Riley sat several feet away, watching, waiting, not begging, not pushing, just hoping. Davis sighed, picked up some leftover food and placed it in front of him. Riley didn't pounce. He looked up at Davis, hesitated, then quietly stepped forward and began to eat, slowly, one bite at a time, like he was afraid of disrespecting the kindness. That night, Riley didn't leave. He curled up in the corner of the yard near the kennels, wrapped in the same old towel Jack had left for him the night before. And like that, day after day, Riley was everywhere people were, yet still hadn't been officially accepted. Jack began watching him more closely. He noticed Riley always waited until everyone else had gone inside before eating. He never fought over toys, never barked back, even when other dogs tried to intimidate him. But sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, Riley would run around the yard with a tiny stick in his mouth, tail wagging nonstop, as if he was on the most important mission of his life. One time, while cleaning the yard, a trainee accidentally dropped a leather glove. Before anyone could pick it up, Riley darted over, gently grabbed it, and brought it back, placing it right in the trainee's hand. Not because someone called his name, not because he'd been trained to, but simply because Riley wanted to help. "This dog, he's trying to be seen," Jack quietly said to himself. Even after being turned away, Riley didn't give up. Every small gesture, every perfectly timed tail wag, every moment he watched and mimicked a simple action, it all seemed to say that he understood, and that he wanted to belong here. On the 6th day, Jack opened Riley's file again. There was still only one line written since that first night. He picked up his pen, but this time, instead of adding a new line, he gently crossed out one word next to the original note, "Status undetermined," and rewrote it in blue ink, "Status under review." On the morning of the 7th day, Riley showed up at the training field just like every other day, before the siren, before anyone else. But this time something was different. Sergeant Jack Monroe was standing in the center of the field, notebook in hand, his eyes no longer indifferent. He called out, loud and clear, "Riley, come here." The puppy bolted forward like he'd been waiting his whole life to hear that command. Even without formal training, Riley had learned his name in just a few days. The way he approached, not too fast, not too slow, eyes locked on Jack, had a few team members exchanging surprised glances. We're going to try a little test, Jack said. Nothing official, just enough to see if he's got a shot. Aaron Jude, the seasoned trainer who first spotted Riley's defect, didn't object, but he gave a quiet warning. If we give him hope and shut the door again, that's gonna hit hard. Jack didn't respond. He simply bent down, gave Riley a gentle pat on the back, then walked onto the training field with the pup at his heel. The first test had no fanfare, no scores, just a series of basic challenges for rookie dogs. Walking off-leash beside a handler, responding to hand signals, following a moving target, and clearing low obstacles. Riley had never been taught, but he'd spent the past week watching, carefully. During the off-leash walk, Riley kept near-perfect spacing. At the obstacle course, he jumped slightly off rhythm. His back legs clipped the wooden rail. A small bump, but it made Jack's brow tighten. Jack signaled to stop the exercise. Riley sat down, lifting his head and waiting for the next command, but Jack simply walked over and gently lifted his back leg. The extra dew claw was long and curled outward, an easy snag when running fast or climbing. The inside of his leg had a few faint scratches, signs that Riley had already hurt himself during solo attempts at training. Double dew claws on the hind legs, Jack said quietly. Both sides. Aaron Jude nodded. I think we should get him checked out, no question. The nearest veterinary clinic was about a 40-minute drive from the training compound. That day, Jack drove Riley himself. No leash, no crate. Riley lay quietly in the back seat, head resting on the edge of the seat, eyes watching the world outside the window, silent the entire ride. The vet, a middle-aged woman named Laura, gave Riley a thorough examination. After closely inspecting the extra claws, she shook her head. This is pretty rare, she said, but it's treatable. Will it affect his ability to work? Jack asked, his voice dropping. If left as is, it's risky, she replied. Dew claws are weak and prone to breaking. When they break, it's extremely painful and can lead to infection. But if we remove them early, he can function just fine. She paused. But there's a catch. What is it? Surgery at this age isn't too complicated, but recovery needs to be carefully monitored. More importantly, for a dog that hasn't been officially accepted, most units wouldn't want to invest in a high-risk case like this. Jack said nothing. Riley was lying quietly at Jack's feet, so calm it almost felt like surrender. It was as if he could sense the tension in the air, and like always, he simply endured it in silence. That night, Jack stayed in his office later than usual. He reopened Riley's file, now a few pages thicker. There were photos, medical reports, notes on temperament, but still no final decision. You have no idea how complicated you're making this, kid, Jack sighed, glancing over at Riley, still lying quietly by the door. Inside him, two voices battled it out. One was the soldier, disciplined, trained to believe that every K9 must be flawless. There's no room for sentiment in the field. The other was just a man, one who had started to feel connected to this little creature who had never once given up. In the end, he picked up his pen and signed off on an internal order. Riley, cleared for basic training trial, approved for dew claw removal surgery as prescribed. The next morning, as Jack's truck pulled away from the compound toward the clinic, Riley jumped into the back seat before the door was even fully open. As if he knew, today was the day that would decide his future. No barking, no fear in his eyes, only complete trust for the one man who had ever seen his worth. Riley walked into the surgery room wearing a temporary collar Jack had brought that morning. No leash. No one had to pull him. He walked like a soldier on a mission, even if that mission meant lying still under harsh white lights and letting someone remove a part of his body. We'll put him under full anesthesia, doctor, Laura said. He seems brave, but when he wakes up, it'll hurt, and for the first few days, he'll be very vulnerable. Jack nodded. I'm staying. He stood behind the glass of the operating room, arms crossed, eyes locked on Riley. Small, motionless, silent, surrounded by IV lines, cold equipment, and the steady beeping of the heart monitor. For a seasoned K9, this would be nothing. But for a puppy who had never truly belonged anywhere, every incision could feel like a moment of fear. The surgery lasted 45 minutes. When it was over, both dew claws had been completely removed. The skin was stitched up with dissolvable sutures. No complications. Better than I expected, Laura said with a tired smile. Now we just monitor for infection and keep up with the antibiotics. Jack stepped inside, kneeling beside Riley as he slowly began to stir. One of the pup's legs twitched slightly, and a soft whimper escaped his mouth like a sigh in a dream. For the first time, Jack reached out and gently placed his hand on Riley's forehead, stroking down the bridge of his nose, slowly. "It's okay, kid. You're gonna be all right." Riley stayed in the recovery room for 3 days. During those 3 days, Jack visited every morning, stayed through the afternoons, and each night he left behind an old military jacket with his scent for Riley to sleep on. On the 4th day, Riley was cleared for discharge. But when Jack opened the car crate to take him back to the training center, Riley didn't move. He lay still, eyes wide open, alert. When Jack reached in, Riley didn't resist, but the way his pupils widened stopped Jack cold. "What's going on?" he asked. Laura tilted her head, looked closely, then let out a quiet breath. "He might think you brought him here to leave him behind." That sentence hit Jack in a way he didn't expect, because he'd seen that look before. Years ago, in a war zone overseas, Jack had rescued a military dog left behind in a crumbling outpost. That dog had looked at him the same way, no barking, no resistance, just an unnamed fear in its eyes, the fear that no one was coming back. Jack didn't say a word. He simply stepped back, sat down on the ground, opened his palm, and placed Riley's favorite biscuit in the center. The pup stared at him for a long time. Then, as if mustering every ounce of courage, Riley stepped out, slowly, cautiously, and dove straight into Jack's lap. "No one's leaving you behind, Riley. I'm not that kind of man." The days that followed marked the beginning of recovery, a challenge even tougher than the surgery itself. His back legs were carefully bandaged, and the dressings had to be changed daily. All training sessions were put on hold. While the other dogs got to run, follow commands, and train with handlers, Riley could only sit at the edge of the field, watching through the metal fence. At first, he accepted it. But by the 3rd day, Riley began to grow restless. Every time Jack left the area, he would get up, press against the fence, eyes fixed on his silhouette. That was the first time Jack ever heard Riley bark. Not an alert bark, not a playful one. It was a bark full of heartbreak, as if to ask, "What did I do wrong to be left behind?" Jack had to come back, kneel by the fence, and slip his hand through to hold Riley by the neck. "Listen, kid, this isn't punishment. You're healing, but I'm still here. You got that?" Riley didn't understand all the words, but he understood one thing. Jack was talking to him. He wasn't being left behind. That night, Jack brought Riley into his office, a privilege no rookie dog had ever been given. He placed an old cushion beside his desk, poured a little water, and laid his jacket next to it. Riley lay down immediately. No whining, no shifting. Just let out a single sigh and fell asleep, as if, after everything, this was finally where he belonged. A week later, Riley's bandages came off for the first time. The incision was healing well, fur starting to grow back around the stitches. But more than his physical recovery, what surprised Jack most was Riley's spirit. No signs of fear, no depression. Instead, he'd become more attached, more observant, quicker to react whenever he heard familiar footsteps nearby. Aaron Jude, the one who had doubted Riley the most, watched the scene and let out a small smile. "Looks like he picked the right person." Jack simply nodded. He didn't need confirmation. Because ever since Riley walked into his office that first night, he knew this dog didn't come here just to be accepted. He came to become something essential. Just a few days after Riley's bandages were completely removed and he began light recovery exercises, the training center gate opened once again. This time, not because a dog broke in, but because a young girl was standing there, holding a tiny, fluffy, and very noisy creature in her arms. "Excuse me, is this the Canine Training Center?" she called out, her voice bright and cheerful. So much so that Aaron Jude actually looked up from his training logs. Behind her stood a corgi, short legs, long body, stubby tail, and a bright cream-colored coat. It was barking non-stop, not out of fear, but clearly from pure excitement. "Her name's Ellie," the girl said, "and this is Milo. We found him near the highway. My mom said we can't keep him, so I was wondering, can you take him in for a while?" Jack stepped out just then. He looked over at Riley, standing by the fence watching quietly, then turned to Milo, who was pawing at Ellie's leg, begging to be picked up again. A brief pause. "All right, but just temporarily," Jack said. "Not sure this place is right for a corgi, but we'll see." Milo was placed in a small kennel near the recovery area, right next to where Riley had been practicing walking. And of course, what was bound to happen did. From the very first glance, Riley didn't like Milo. The little corgi was smaller, chubbier, but showed zero fear. On the contrary, he boldly trotted over, sniffed Riley with an air of entitlement, and wagged his tail like they were already best friends. Riley froze. For the first time since arriving at the facility, another creature wasn't the least bit cautious around him. Aaron Jude chuckled. Looks like Riley's main character status might be in trouble. In those first few days, Riley kept his distance from Milo, even though Milo followed him everywhere. From the training field to the feeding area, from the fence line to the duty office entrance, Riley still tried to avoid him. One time, Milo snatched the rubber ball Riley usually played with. Whether it was on purpose or not, no one knew, but Riley let out a low growl. The first growl Jack had ever heard from the usually well-behaved pup. Jack didn't scold him. He simply placed a hand gently on Riley's head. "Don't worry, no one's replacing you." Still, Milo didn't give up. His playful, quick-witted, mischief-loving, and stubborn in the cutest way nature had the whole team laughing several times a day. Milo didn't believe in personal space. He would crawl into the glove bin, nap in the tool drawer, or casually chew on a trainer's shoelaces right in the middle of a drill. One afternoon, while Riley was practicing short-distance recall drills, Milo suddenly darted into the middle of the field and charged after him. The two nearly collided. Riley let out a low growl, but this time, he didn't walk away. He stopped, stared at Milo, then gave chase. Not to fight, to play. From that moment on, every afternoon turned into a game of tag between the two of them, running laps around the yard like an inseparable pair. Milo loved to roll in the sand and crash into Riley. Riley started copying Milo's trick of grabbing a toy and baiting the trainer into chasing him. One time, they both climbed up onto the hay barrels behind the supply shed, something no dog had ever attempted before. Jack started noticing strange new behaviors in Riley. He barked more, not out of stress, but during play. He approached strangers more often, especially children. And for the first time, when a trainer gave the down command, Riley not only obeyed, he looked at Milo and signaled with his eyes. Milo lay down right after. Aaron raised an eyebrow at the sight. "Is Riley training Milo? Or Milo's pulling Riley out of his shell?" Jack replied, smiling. A week later, Ellie returned. She held a worn-out blue collar in her hand. Beside her was a middle-aged woman, her mom. "We found Milo's original owners," the woman said. "They lost him during a vacation. Just saw the photo we posted online." Ellie looked down. She didn't say a word, just hugged Milo tightly. Riley stayed at a distance, not moving closer. But his eyes followed Milo's every step, as if trying to memorize the image of his friend one last time. When Ellie stepped forward, Riley stood. Milo stretched toward him, gave a soft lick on Riley's cheek, then gently pressed his head into Riley's neck, a quiet gesture that said everything. Goodbyes aren't always about tears. Sometimes they're just a silent promise. If we meet again, remember, we were once a part of each other. Riley didn't stay sad for long, but after that day, he barked less and spent more time lying in his usual corner of the yard. And Jack, on a still, windless evening, added a new note to Riley's file. Good interaction with other dogs, shows ability to form bonds, strong potential for team-based canine work. Ever since the day Ellie and her mother came back to take Milo home, the Canine Training Center felt like it was missing a piece of its color. No more high-pitched, offbeat barking. No more short, stubby shadow darting across the yard every time someone dropped something. And no more scenes of Riley crouched behind the sandpit, waiting to pounce on the only friend he'd ever had. Milo had gone home. And Riley, for the first time, truly understood what it meant to lose something. The afternoon after their goodbye, Riley didn't come out to the yard like he usually did. He stayed curled in the corner of his kennel, head turned toward the wall. No whining, no barking, no response, even when Jack called his name. At dinner time, he only ate half his portion, something that had never happened since the day he'd been allowed to stay. Aaron Jude noticed it first. "He's grieving," he said, standing next to Jack in the surveillance room. Not because he was left behind, but because he lost a part of himself. Jack nodded. "It's something he needed to go through." "Needed to?" Yeah, everyone has to learn how to face goodbye eventually. If he doesn't learn it from a friend now, he might not survive it later when it's a teammate he loses. 3 days later, Riley returned to the training yard, but he didn't bounce around like before, and the speed drills no longer excited him. Whenever someone dropped an item, Riley still ran over. But he didn't bring it back right away. He'd set it down on the ground, stare at it for a long moment as if waiting for something familiar to happen. But nothing did. At night, Riley still lay in the same spot, the one where he and Milo used to rest after playtime. He stared blankly at the empty yard, occasionally giving a soft wag of his tail, then curled up to sleep alone. Jack didn't intervene, he just watched. And during one training log update, he wrote, "Riley shows strong emotional response to change. Group training paused, monitoring psychological adjustment." A week passed. One cold morning, just after Riley finished a slow stair-climbing exercise, Jack walked onto the field with an envelope in his hand. Inside was a postcard from Ellie. "To Uncle Jack and the trainers, thank you for taking care of Milo. He still remembers Riley. I hope one day they can see each other again." At the bottom was a faded photo. Milo lying in a garden, surrounded by a mountain of toys, still wearing the old blue collar. Jack smiled softly. He held the photo out for Riley to sniff. And almost instinctively, Riley lifted his head, licked his lips, then stretched forward toward the picture. "Yeah," Jack murmured. "I miss the little guy too." Nearly 2 months after their goodbye, during the first scent tracking test for the young dogs, the training center gate opened. This time, unexpectedly, a silver pickup truck pulled up to the curb. Ellie stepped out first, and right behind her came a short, round-bellied figure with the same smooth, cream-colored coat as before, charging straight toward the gate, barking wildly. Riley heard it first. He lifted his head, ears perked, and it took him exactly 3 seconds to realize what was happening. Before any of the trainers could react, Riley bolted from the side yard, dashed across the open field, and stopped right at the edge of the fence. Milo stopped too on the other side. The two dogs stood facing each other, separated by a few metal bars and 2 long months apart. Riley barked once, short and sharp. Milo barked back. Then neither of them said a word. Milo slipped his tongue through the fence, giving Riley's nose a gentle lick. Riley didn't move, he simply closed his eyes and leaned his head against the bars, staying there for a long moment. Ellie stepped forward. "I'm sorry for showing up out of nowhere," she said, "but we're moving soon, far away. Milo won't have anyone to play with anymore." She hesitated, then pulled out a small leather leash. "I just wanted to let him come and say goodbye." Jack smiled. "This time, is it really goodbye?" Ellie nodded. Jack looked down at Riley, still pressed close to Milo, unwilling to take a single step away. "Give him a few more minutes," Jack said. "He deserves a proper farewell." When Milo finally left, Riley didn't chase after him. He stood still by the fence, watching until the truck disappeared behind the trees. No barking, no whining, no attempt to break through. He just stood there, like a soldier seeing his comrade off. That night, Riley curled up in his usual corner of the yard. But this time, he slept soundly, without looking back. Jack quietly added a single line to his training file. "First experience with loss. Still standing." The next morning started like any other. Riley completed his basic drills ahead of the group and trotted over to the second training area without needing to be called. The difficulty level increased. His reaction time was now rated as approaching official K9 standards. Everything was falling into place until a white civilian vehicle pulled up outside the gate. The woman who stepped out was well-dressed but carried the weary look of someone who had been searching for far too long. In her hand was a crumpled folder, photos, vet records, and handwritten notes scribbled in haste. "I'm here looking for my dog," the woman said, her voice uncertain. "I think one of the dogs here might be Max." Jack stepped out to meet her. He'd gotten used to mistaken visits over the years, but this time felt different. She wasn't here out of curiosity. She was here with hope. They brought Riley out to the main field, the safest, most familiar space for him. Riley walked out with steady steps. He noticed the stranger, ears perked, eyes wide, but showed no signs of fear. The moment she saw Riley, the woman froze. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Max? Is that you?" She dropped to her knees, arms wide open, her voice trembling as she called out, "Max, come here, baby, it's Mommy." The entire training yard seemed to hold its breath. Riley stood still, his eyes locked on the woman, but he didn't move. No movement, no bark, no reaction. The woman looked up, eyes brimming with tears. He looks exactly like Max. The way he stands, his coat, the way he tilts his head when he hears a whistle. Jack stepped in gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. His name is Riley. He's been here for over 2 months now. But Max went missing more than 3, she choked. I thought someone might have taken him. Aaron Jude, standing nearby, leaned in and whispered to Jack, "Could be Riley did belong to someone once. No chip, no papers, we can't be sure of anything." Jack didn't argue, but he looked at Riley, still standing in the middle of the yard, his gaze steady, neither avoiding nor recognizing the woman in front of him. Jack knew Riley, and he knew, if Riley had ever known that woman, he would have reacted. Even just a glance, a soft wag of the tail, but there was nothing. He stood there as if watching a stranger call out the wrong name. The woman left not long after. She wasn't angry. She didn't plead. She just looked at Riley for a long time, then whispered, "If you're not Max, then please live a good life. And if you are, and you've forgotten me, I still forgive you." The words lingered in the air, heavier than rejection. Riley only turned his head when the gate closed. He didn't watch the car pull away. He just looked up at the sky, where a single bird passed overhead as the wind fell still. That night, Jack stayed in his office long after hours. He opened Riley's file, flipping back to the very first note. Day 1, Riley appeared. No collar, no history. And beneath it, he added a quiet line. Day 62. May have had a past, but now Riley belongs here. Aaron stopped by, tapping gently on the door. What do you make of today? Jack shrugged. I think Riley doesn't look backward. He only sees the one standing in front of him. Aaron nodded. And that person is you. Jack didn't reply, but deep down he knew. Some questions will never have answers. Who was Riley? Where did he come from? Who did he once belong to? But maybe the real question wasn't who he used to be. It was who he is now. After the Max incident, something shifted in Riley. Not a dramatic change. He was still quiet, focused, and instinct-driven. But there was something in his eyes now, a new kind of resolve. As if from that moment on, Riley understood. He didn't need to search for who he was. The only thing left was to become who he chose to be. And that journey was anything but easy. The first week of advanced training, Riley struggled. Obstacle navigation came first. A row of high fences, slick ramps, and narrow pipes the dogs had to crawl through. The others, raised and trained from puppyhood, adapted in days. But Riley, though quick and clever, lacked muscle control and raw strength. At the second wall, he slipped. The landing twisted one of his legs slightly. Jack rushed over, but Riley stood up immediately. No whimper, no reaction. Still, the next time Jack gave the signal to go over, Riley just stood there. He turned his head and walked away. Jack didn't call him back. He simply watched as Riley retreated to the far corner of the yard, lay down, panting heavily, and turned his face to the wall, just like the day Milo left. That night, Jack said nothing. He simply left Riley lying in the office as usual, without petting or comforting him. He understood that some challenges had to be faced by Riley on his own. If he wanted to become a true canine, giving up could not be the only option. On the third day, Riley returned to the obstacle course field. No one called him. No one pushed him. He walked up on his own, looked at the second wall, and then took off, this time slowly, more controlled. He slipped but did not fall. The second time, he went a little higher. And the third time, he cleared it. The entire team clapped. Riley didn't notice. He simply looked at Jack, his eyes not needing praise, only acknowledgement. Jack nodded, ever so slightly, but enough for Riley to perk up, as if a great burden had been lifted from his heart. After the obstacles came scent tracking. Scent detection is one of the toughest parts of canine training. The dogs have to identify a human scent through various objects, gloves, jackets, shoes, dirt, and stay focused despite layers of distracting smells across the field. Riley, no one knew why, had an exceptional nose. But the problem was, he didn't follow the usual path. While other dogs moved in straight lines from point A to point B, Riley circled wide, zigzagged, or cut corners. When called back, he wouldn't turn around. Aaron Jude repeatedly suggested he was getting distracted, but Jack quietly watched the tiny paw prints left in the sand. And he realized, Riley was still on track. He was following the scent, just in his own way. Jack didn't correct Riley to fit the standard route. Instead, he adjusted the drills to test reactions. And the results? Riley located the final target faster than the other dogs, even if his path looked nothing like theirs. Maybe, Aaron said. He's not breaking the rules. He's just rewriting how the game is played. The discipline test was the most unforgiving part. Each dog was placed in front of its favorite meal. The task: don't touch it until given the command. Any movement, a glance, a lean, a flick of the tongue counted as a fail. Veteran dogs could wait up to 2 full minutes. Riley, on his first try, lasted 7 seconds. Second try, 12. Third, 15. Aaron gestured to Jack, suggesting they swap in a less tempting food. But Jack shook his head. I want him to learn to resist what he wants most. On the 5th day, Jack changed the test by simply sitting down next to Riley. You're not alone, Jack said, looking Riley straight in the eye. We endure it together. We overcome it together. And that time, Riley didn't eat, didn't reach forward, didn't even glance sideways, until Jack whispered, Good, go ahead. Riley took the piece of meat, no rush, then calmly lay down next to Jack as if he had just completed a mission. Not just for his trainer, but for himself. By the 3rd month of training, Riley had changed noticeably. He began taking initiative, assisting other dogs during group drills, retrieving dropped items without being told, stepping back politely when meeting unfamiliar people. But above all, he had learned to read Jack's eyes. One nod, a furrowed brow, a subtle shift of the shoulders. That was all it took for Riley to know what was expected of him. He's not a finished K9 yet. Aaron observed, but if he keeps this up, I think he's going to make it. Jack said nothing. But that night, Jack wrote a single line in Riley's file. The transformation has begun. A once nameless dog now defining himself. 4 months since Riley first stepped through the training center gate, not a single person on the team still referred to him as the stray. No one mentioned the due clause that had nearly disqualified him. And no one questioned Jack's decision when he called out Riley's name for the final evaluation, the ultimate test to become an official K9. The exam was held on a crisp October morning, with dew clinging to the edges of the grass and cold wind threading its way through the steel fence. The entire team was quieter than usual. Each young dog had been bathed, fitted with numbered training vests. Riley wore number 07, coincidence or fate, no one could say for sure. The first stage was terrain navigation. High walls, sand pits, dark tunnels, and balance bridges. Riley completed it flawlessly, not a single misstep. His body no longer stumbled like in the early days. Each leap was sharp, firm, fast, but controlled. The second stage was scent tracking in a simulated rescue scenario. A victim had been carefully hidden inside a mock disaster zone, built to mimic an earthquake collapse. Riley was sent in alone, no handler, just a scrap of clothing carrying the victim's scent. He caught the right trail from the very first step. Jack stood outside, watching via the thermal camera. Riley moved quickly, but each step was deliberate. While other dogs were still circling the collapsed wall area, Riley shifted course, doubling back toward a makeshift shelter in the rear. At 8 minutes and 31 seconds, he barked 3 times, the signal that he had found the target. Full marks. Fast response. Clean path. One of the examiners leaned over and whispered to Jack, "He moves like he's done this before." Jack didn't reply. He just watched Riley, standing calmly at the edge of the tent, waiting for his next command. The final test was rapid command response in a simulated emergency. Trainers would call out 3 back-to-back commands. Come, stop, down. The dog had to respond at the exact moment each command was given. Even a half-second delay would count as a fail. Jack hadn't trained Riley directly on this drill. Aaron Jude was in charge of this part. When it was Riley's turn, he was led to the starting mark. The wind had picked up. A few dogs had already failed, either stopping too late or lying down in the wrong spot. Come! Aaron shouted. Riley bolted forward. Stop! Riley froze instantly. Paws locked, tail stiff in the air. Down! He dropped like a stone, flat, still, no hesitation, no confusion. The judging panel all nodded in unison. Not a single fault. That afternoon, the results were posted on the bulletin board. Under the column labeled Certified K9 Status Achieved, on the 7th line, printed in bold. 7. Average score 9.810. Reflexes, scent tracking, terrain navigation, teamwork outstanding. The entire team burst into applause. Someone whistled. Aaron clapped a hand on Jack's shoulder and grinned. He did it. Jack didn't say a word. He just looked at Riley, lying beneath the bulletin board, ears lowered gently, as if he already understood. This was only the beginning. That night, in the office, Jack opened Riley's file once again. The first page was worn, the edges of the paper frayed from being flipped through so many times. Day 1, Riley appeared. No collar, no history, but perhaps a reason to stay. Now, he wrote a new line underneath. Day 124, Riley is officially recognized, not just for his skills, but for never giving up. But just as he closed the folder, Aaron walked in, his expression no longer as relaxed as before. Jack, there's an urgent mission. Tomorrow night. Jack looked up. Us? No, Riley. The snowstorm hit the Colorado mountains earlier than expected. That night, just as Jack was about to leave his office, he received a call from the local police. A man had gone missing while searching for his lost dog near the northern woods. The snow had already started to pile up, phone signals were completely lost, and the chances of survival after 12 hours were diminishing by the minute. We need a K9 with strong scent tracking skills. Urgent, the voice on the other end said. Jack paused for just a second before responding. We've got one. Riley had never been on a real mission before. Even though he had just passed the final evaluation, he was supposed to wait for an official assignment. But there was no time to wait now. 2 a.m. The sky was torn apart by the howling winds. The entire forest was blanketed in a cold, blinding white mist. Jack and Riley were brought to the last known location of the missing person's vehicle. All that remained were a few faint footprints fading away in the snow. Humans might not trace the scent, but Riley has a chance, Jack whispered, attaching a reflective light to Riley's collar. He knelt down, handing Riley a woolen hat that had been confirmed to belong to the missing person. Take a good sniff, kid. This isn't training anymore. Riley sniffed for a long time. Then, unexpectedly, he turned his head and dashed in an unexpected direction, following the edge of a frozen creek, weaving through fallen trees that had collapsed under the snowstorm's weight. Jack sprinted after him, the static crackling endlessly over the radio. The wind grew stronger, erasing the footprints within minutes. Without Riley, the rescue team would have surely lost their way. Each time Jack thought he was about to lose the trail, the reflective light on Riley's collar would flicker in the darkness, leading the way, steady as a living compass. Finally, Riley stopped. He barked 3 times, loud, sharp, just like the bark in the rescue test. Jack rushed forward. Tucked in a low rock crevice near the base of a large tree was a man, curled up and trembling, his face pale from the cold and exhaustion. We found him, Jack shouted into the radio. Send medical to the coordinates I just gave. Riley didn't move from his position. He lay next to the man, using his body to keep him warm. As if understanding that warmth at this moment meant life. When the rescue team arrived, the man had regained consciousness, mumbling a few inaudible words of thanks. Riley stepped back but kept his eyes locked on him. You saved me, the man whispered. Jack placed a hand on Riley's back and softly said, No, he chose you. The next morning, as dawn broke, the team returned to the camp. Riley stepped off the truck, still covered in the ice and snow that hadn't completely melted. But his eyes were clear, sharp. He didn't run around. He walked straight to the training field and lay down in his familiar spot, quiet, simple, like a warrior who had completed his first mission. Aaron stepped forward and placed the biggest treat the team had ever used beside Riley. You've earned this. Jack said nothing. He simply stood there, hands in his pockets, looking at Riley with an expression no other dog in the camp had ever received. That evening, Riley's file was officially stamped. K9 Mission Grade 1, completed first real rescue mission. Excellent reflexes. Maintained composure under extreme conditions. Loyal, committed, acts independently and appropriately, meets standards for independent teamwork. Jack added one final line by hand. Once a gatecrasher, now an irreplaceable part of the team. A few days later, as the snow began to melt, someone asked Jack, if it had been another dog that day, do you think things would have ended the same way? Jack looked out at the field, where Riley lay, the sunlight shining on his darker coat which had thickened over the winter. No, he replied. Only Riley could do what Riley did. No one knew where Riley came from. He had no papers, no collar, No one came forward to claim him. But what made him accepted wasn't a name or a perfect background. It was his unwavering determination. It was a gaze that never backed down, even after being rejected. It was the return, time after being turned away. It was the silence of endurance instead of resentment. And above all, it was the unconditional love for humans. Riley wasn't trained to be a hero. He simply wanted to stay, to be recognized, to do what was right. And that simple desire is what turned a dog once thought to be nameless into an irreplaceable part of the canine team. If you have a dog, remember, sometimes even the smallest creature has a heart big enough to save a human. And if you ever feel like you're not good enough, not special enough, think of Riley, because sometimes simply not giving up is already a victory. Support us by liking, sharing, and subscribing to the Dog Stories channel so you can hear more incredible journeys like this, where love, loyalty, and courageous dogs become our guides. Have you ever met a Riley in your life? Leave a comment. We'd love to hear your story.